joined today by Erin McClelland, Democratic candidate for state treasurer. Why are you seeking this office?
I'm seeking this office because, A, I love the policy involved in it, monetary policy, fiscal policy. That fascinates me. But furthermore, there's so much more that you can do with this office than we've ever seen before. There's a lot of opportunities policy-wise, money-wise, to get outside the office and do things in the community. So I always say I'm not going right, I'm not going left, I'm going local. And municipal government's very important, and there's a lot this office can do there. So that's a big part of it. Another issue is I think that we spend a lot of time in politics trying to look perfect, deflecting the problems that we see in government. And one of the things that I learned a long time ago is if you truly want transparency, the root of it starts with being open and transparent at the hard moments where things go wrong. And I don't think we see that. We've gotten to this place where we never want to admit something went wrong and everybody makes mistakes. The important thing is when you make them, do you own them? Do you learn from them? And do you use them to correct the system? And that's a passion of mine. And we've gotten into a government that we campaign on, character limits and hashtags. And you can't reform any system that way. And that's a big part of my background and what I'm very passionate about in this office.
For those that may not be familiar with your background, tell us a little bit about the experience that you would bring to this office.
So I grew up in a very working class mill town on the outskirts of Allegheny County. We still have a steel mill there, believe it or not. And I come from 4 generations of organized labor. But my master's degree is in the psychology of complex adaptive systems, which is the behavior of really big systems and how people tend to react when groupthink kicks in. And so big government systems fascinate me. I did run a small business, started it. It was the first of its kind in the state, raised $2 million in venture funding for that. And we were actually featured twice in Industrial Engineer magazine as a case study. So having actually made a payroll, the only person in this race that can say that they've done that. And there is nothing that tests your mettle faster than hitting the 15th and not being able to make your payroll or figuring out how you're going to do it. I also got to spend a year with the Pittsburgh Regional Healthcare Initiative. Mr. O'Neill was there, and I was working at the Institute of Research, Education, and Training in Addiction. So we were both doing really systemic reforms.
And when you say Mr. O'Neill, Paul O'Neill, former treasurer.
Yeah, and I learned so much from him and the work that we did. I was doing a lot in addiction systems on performance and determining what success rates were, things like that. But he taught us a lot about reforming systems. He taught us a lot about the need for transparency and honesty. And so a lot of those values, I think, probably served him well in the Treasury, maybe a little too well in the fact that he was asked to leave when he was being too transparent. But that was an inspiration to me, and those are values that I'd like to bring to this office.
Since you talk so much about transparency, if elected, what would you do to bring that great sense of transparency and more confidence in the office? Yeah,
I think a lot of it has to do with the good and the bad. When you read the most recent asset report from the current treasurer, I think it was released December 15th, it's all very glowing and very padded. I would like to know where she identifies need for improvement. And I looked all through the asset report and I didn't see that. That's something that I would do. These are things that we can do better. Again, I don't think this should be a very political office. You should be honest with people. And when you're giving a report out to the people of Pennsylvania, you should be telling them this is where we did good, this is where we need to improve. I don't see a lot of that. So that's a big part of it.
For those that are not familiar, what are some of the mainstay responsibilities of the state treasurer?
So the state treasurer traditionally has managed all the 3 pension funds. It's considered the 4 funds. So you have the 3 big pensions funds. 43% of the treasury is the teacher's pension alone. And then you have the general fund, which consists of a number of different funds from where we put our medical marijuana money, which has a separate fund. And so they typically manage all that. They also enforce contract oversight. So the treasurer writes the check. And when you're looking at contracts, do we follow the law? What was a big inspiration to me was Grace Sloan was the first female treasurer, and she was notorious for doing what she thought was right, which did not really jive with the governor at the time. So they spent time in court, and she often won because she was doing the right thing. And she had more of a watchdog perspective on the job. I like that. I think with a lot of the trade reforms we've seen in the federal government, probably more than we've ever seen before, there's so much opportunity in the Treasurer's office to say, no, you're not following this trade policy, so I can't write this check. There's also an opportunity with all of that Inflation Reduction Act money coming in and infrastructure money to say this is how this has to be spent. So these are the vendors that we're recommending you use, vendors that don't purchase conflict-mined materials or buy products from the Xinjiang province of China, where 1.2 million people are in slave labor camps. Those are things that we should be looking at, and I think the Treasurer should be looking at, and supporting our municipalities as they're getting this money to make sure the way that they're spending it really aligns with the values we have here on workers and production.
Can you expand upon that a little bit? You had said that you want to go beyond the traditional roles of the Treasurer and be more local. Can you talk a little bit more about what that would look like under your watch?
Sure. So the first thing that I saw was that the National Association of State Treasurers really started talking about cybersecurity as a responsibility for the state treasurer. Joe Torsella, when he was in office, started talking about this and doing hearings on it. And seeing what's happened recently in Pennsylvania alone with the Aliquippa Water Authority being hacked by Iran and getting control of the water supply there for a brief period of time, as well as Chester losing $400,000 in a phishing scheme. And then the entire government of Washington County was shut down for, I think it was almost 2 weeks, in a ransomware attack that cost them $350,000. I believe this issue is the fierce urgency of now. Every day we lose time, and this is about time. On average, IBM did a report saying it takes about 9 hours for somebody to really initiate one of these attacks. It takes us 96 days to even figure out that it's coming. So every moment that we waste not getting in front of this, not educating our municipalities on the basic things they can do. We have a program in the Treasury that protects the taxpayers' $163 billion. There's no reason that the Treasurer shouldn't be transforming that data into something palatable for every borough council member or township supervisor. You know, the small municipalities that don't have the sophisticated infrastructure to take this on themselves. They really need our help. And from my meetings with those folks throughout the state, they're not even looking at this as a partisan issue. They are looking at it as a very, very serious threat to how we operate every day when you look at our water authorities or our emergency response systems or our banks.
On your website, you note rebuilding the state supply chain as a priority. Yeah. What's been the holdup in the supply chain, and how do we address that?
Well, I think, it goes to what I said earlier about, how we select vendors that we use state money on. We've not done a lot of work on that at all. Supply chain logistics is something that I also learned when I was learning under Mr. O'Neill and the Pittsburgh Regional Healthcare Initiative. So that's an expertise that I have, and it's something I'm very passionate about because we can say all the hashtags about made in America or all the things that we want to do, but the devil's always in the details, and those details are always in supply chain. So if you really have that value, then you've got to find a way to bake it in. And we can do these trade policies more service if we make sure they're baked into how we purchase, to how our procurement processes are developed. And then if we bake them in, then they can be there for a generation to come instead of just for however the legislature does it or Congress.
You said that rebuilding the supply chain also involves utilizing labor and environmental standards. How do those fit into the equation?
Yes, so again, when I was talking about conflict mining, when you're looking at purchasing solar panels through the Inflation Reduction Act, I want to make sure that those are purchased because they're an environmental product and it's very, very important. But I want to make sure it's done in a way that where it is manufactured in a country that also maintains those labor standards. John F. Kennedy once said, "We all breathe the same air." So simply saying, well, I don't want it in my backyard, but I'll buy it over here, doesn't really solve the root cause of the problem. The other thing with environmental standards is our current treasurer has been really against ESG ratings. So that's environmental sustainability and governance. She wrote a letter to BlackRock complaining that they were advocating for this. Now, BlackRock is not exactly a beacon of environmental sentiment. So I think when you're to the right of BlackRock, when we're looking at creating standards for stocks and organizations that we invest in that go far beyond simply what the P&L is. And when Congress had a hearing on this and the importance of looking at more than just the bottom line, one of the arguments was Pfizer. Pfizer's P&L looked really, really good to a lot of people. However, they were creating an entire generation of addicted persons in the process of getting those profits. So I really do believe we need to get there. We're not there yet on that rating system. I'd love to be a leader in that conversation and see how we can enforce ideas of governance and diversity, labor policies, environmental policies in how we spend the people's money and build those values, again, baking them into the coffer instead of just talking about them.
You've said that you'd like to repeal the Keystone Saves retirement savings program. Can you explain what that is and what your concerns are? Yeah,
sure. There's a program that's been sort of peddled throughout the country by a gentleman named John Arnold. Mr. Arnold was an oil speculator at Enron, and he's devoted his fortune to annihilating public sector pensions. Part of the process of doing that is creating a splinter savings program. I'm a Democrat, so I don't see any program that does not allow an employer contribution as a retirement. It's just a savings program. This particular program and the legislation that passed the House does not allow ERISA protections, so it is not covered by basic retirement legislation in Congress. Second of all, it does not permit the employer to contribute, even though every small business in the state would be mandated to participate in it if they have more than 5 employees and don't currently offer retirement. I don't really like that that's how they're doing this mandate. They're also mandating that those employers report every one of their employees' information to the state treasurer. I have no idea why the treasurer would need that information. I don't think it's appropriate. I think it's an overreach. Furthermore, the type of financial product they're offering through that program, and it's only one product, it's called a self-directed IRA. This thing is so bad. The Securities and Exchange Commission did a 4-page alert in February of last year, claiming that it is highly susceptible to fraud. Now, this program, theoretically, would be offered to bartenders and baristas who are working in the service industry, small businesses. This is not the type of program we should be encouraging them to invest in. It's high risk. It's exposed to alternative currencies, commodities. There's no real restrictions on it, and I think it's a very dangerous product. I think there's much better ways to do it. Oregon Saves was running it. Their launch showed that people were enrolled in it without their knowledge. Their program had a 5% default contribution rate, which means employees that were enrolled without their knowledge also got 5% of their payroll deducted without their knowledge. And in California, the same program is in court because they're trying to figure out who somebody's going to sue if the program goes bad. Furthermore, you're not allowed, as somebody putting money into this, to contact the manager of the fund. That's built into the legislation. So I find it unbelievably unstable, very volatile, and dangerous. So yes, I don't want to see that come to fruition at all.
And a reminder, viewers, where is this in the legislative process right now?
It passed the House. The Senate, the Republicans in the Senate have demonstrated that they don't have a lot of interest in running it. It is a program that our current treasurer has advocated for and did press on as late as I think December. So she's still for it. My Democratic opponent voted for it. So I'm the only one in the race that's against this. And I can't figure out why anybody on my side of the aisle would be for something like this. I call it the George W. Bush Great Recession Starter Kit because that's exactly what it is.
Beyond the Keystone Saves program, would you like to see Pennsylvania develop some sort of retirement program for Pennsylvanians that do not have access to a workplace provided program at this time?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. You'd love, the dream, right, is to create a defined benefit program statewide for every worker that does involve employer contributions. That's the theoretical limit of that idea. Wouldn't be very easy to achieve, and you definitely need legislation to do it. But yeah, that's the theoretical limit goal, that everybody has access to a retirement program that is a stable defined benefit program and does have employer contribution.
On a very different issue, the Treasury Department hosts a 529 program for those that are saving for their kids' college education.
Yeah.
What would you do to make this an attractive option to Pennsylvanians?
So there's been a great deal of legislation expanding what you can do with a 529. I think that's the biggest thing. Let's say you start it, you put money into it. The concern has been for a number of people, well, what if my child doesn't go to college? What happens to that money? The federal government has done a lot to address that. There's options to roll over, put it into other savings programs. So I think a big part of promoting the program is educating the public on, even if you don't decide to use this for, post-grad education, there's a lot of other opportunities that you can use it on as far as materials, as well as other savings programs that the government offers. So it can be rolled over, it can even be rolled over into an IRA. So those new options, I think, make it more appealing. And our 529 is one of only 2 gold-rated 529s in the country. So it is a program that we should be very, very proud of. When Joe Torsella did the Keystone Scholars program, which gives every newborn baby or newly adopted baby a $100 contribution right out of the gate, I think that made a big difference in it. So it's something we should definitely be promoting and expanding and educating people that you're not locked in to college. There's other options there.
You've expressed a commitment to helping communities that are unbanked and underbanked. Why are some communities lacking banking resources?
Well, a lot of it started with the savings and loan crisis that we saw, back in the 80s. Since then, banks have become too big to fail. We know from 2008. So over time, because of deregulation, because of things like the elimination of federal Glass-Steagall, it's been harder and harder for smaller banks to sustain, and they keep being swallowed up by big banks. So it is important that in these communities that they're unbanked, that they have somebody local where people can put their deposits into their local bank, and those deposits go back out in loans for homes or college education to the people in their communities. It's really important to get back to getting fully banked communities, and we're a long way from there. The fact that the Biden administration has done a mission-driven banking program that provides capitalization for those and a framework for creating those institutions. It's a shame that we're not taking advantage of it. They provide opportunities to create minority deposit institutions, community development financial institutions. We only have 3 minority deposit institutions in the entire state, to my knowledge. 2 are in Philadelphia, 1 is in Montgomery County. On my side of the state, there's none. These are banks that are really inspired by the early community banks and also encouraged to be owned by people of color and women.
The state treasurer has the power to decide where the state invests roughly about $50 billion of its savings. Should political or humanitarian considerations be taken into account when you're making these investments?
Well, I think you always have to take the political climate and humanitarian, absolutely. We don't want to be investing in any humanitarian crisis that we're encouraging the mistreatment of human beings. We should always have a value of safety in everything that we do, and that includes the human condition and physical wellness. I have not been a big supporter of foreign holdings. That's a relatively new thing. If you look at in the past, that we didn't really promote politically foreign holdings as some sort of political argument with the state coffers, and we certainly shouldn't be doing that with pension money. So I did say that I would not have supported putting pension money into Israeli bonds, and that's not so much about the conflict there, but the fact that they had a labor strike, massive labor strike last March, would have been the first thing that would have grabbed my attention. When you have that level of unrest amongst your own people, that's sort of a red flag. That labor strike grew bigger in the summer whenever hospital workers were walking out. So that's a big red flag. And then after the attack by Hamas, their credit went under review. So that should have been the moment where you're looking and saying, hey, do we have holdings there? I mean, we might want to consider, if we want them there. Instead, our treasurer doubled down on that and put that money in. I would say that was a mistake. And the fact that their credit was downgraded recently for the first time ever, as well as the credit of 5 of their major banks, that's alarming. Now, her perspective is that there's a higher yield. That's correct. She's not wrong. But the question you have to look at is high risk, high reward. The reason that the yield on those bonds has gone up is because they are taking on an incredible amount of debt, and they have to pay more to get that money in. The question after you start taking in high risk and really over leveraging is how do you secure the debt? And I think it's about 80% of that debt is being insured by credit default swaps. Well, 2008 called and they want their financial policies back. That is not what we should be investing in. So I'm fundamentally against all of that.
The Pennsylvania Capital Star recently reported that your campaign raised and spent money for this race prior to registering with the Department of State. Can you explain what happened?
Yeah, sure. I had another PAC that had money in it, so we were spending that first. But all of that money was going to that race. We reported all of that information in the two PACs. We did talk to the election department, and we do have an email from the election department saying they deem us in compliance. They also gave us instruction on how they recommend we move forward on that. So, I feel fine that we did. Obviously, we should have filed the authorization earlier, but we were running it through a PAC. So lesson learned. And again, I fully own that error. The interesting thing about the Capital Star article was that my primary opponent did the exact same thing. He did not file. My authorization was filed January 31st. His wasn't filed until February 22nd. I think the difference in that, and he's been very critical of me, I have not criticized him at all. I've not said a word, nor has anybody else mentioned that he made the same error. I've simply taken the opportunity to own the error myself, discuss what we did wrong and what we need to do moving forward, but ultimately ensuring that the spirit of the law, that every dime is disclosed, is the important part. And I believe that we did that. I also believe that Ryan Bizzarro did that, which is why I never attacked him on it. The difference is he was running two campaigns out of the PAC that he didn't authorize his treasurer race on. I was running one campaign. So I would say that, it's a filing issue. It's been corrected. Everything's been filed. The election department is fine with what we're doing. My criticism there is I was the type of person that owned the mistake. And even during the interview, I was very transparent, provided all the documentation, even offered copies of my bank statements. The reporter never mentioned that we did give him an email from the state saying we were in compliance. I never brought up my opponent's error in this situation, nor was it ever brought up in the interview, which really points to the fact this wasn't about uncovering an error that everybody was making in the cycle. It was just about me. So that's how I look at that. And I think that's just part of politics when you're running against the entire machine of your party and running on an idea of encouraging people to own their mistakes and really talk about what's happening in politics. And I think that's really important right now. And it was important for me to show the type of character that didn't deflect, didn't lash out at my opponent, say, well, he did it too, because that would be petty and dismissive. And my responsibility as treasurer would be to be first and foremost accountable for my behavior or any actions that I take. And I think that I've shown the voters who I am. He's shown the voters who he is. And now it's up to them to decide who they really want in charge of that $163 billion.
The treasurer's race may not garner the same headlines as the presidential race or the U.S. Senate even. Yeah. What are you doing to get your message out and get the attention of voters?
Right now, a lot of it is going local. I've been campaigning like crazy, 4 and 5 different counties a day. So being out there is really important to me, talking a lot to local electeds, because in a low information race like this, where a lot of people don't even know there is a treasurer, much less who it is, a lot of times they'll go to their local electeds, their township supervisor, and say, hey, what is this? Who do we like for this? Oh, well, I met her. So that's a big part of it. Another part is definitely doing a lot of press on policy. And really making sure that you're engaging the top ticket races. I've been on a campaign where I was running for Congress during a presidential cycle. I was on the ballot with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And I can tell you that in the interviews with MSNBC or CNN, most of the questions were about the top of the ticket. They weren't really asking about my race. So I think whoever the nominee is, it's going to be really important that they're able to talk intelligently about Joe Biden's inflation policies. That, I think, is going to be a top issue. You're going to have to really address how he did with qualitative easing and that strategy for inflation reduction, we're going to get those questions. So I am very prepared to start talking about that as well to help support the top of the ticket and let people in Pennsylvania know that Democrats do deserve another term in the White House. And it's so important when you are perceived as being in power. We have the governor, we have the president. If we aren't out there talking about what's next, how do you harness that power and make it transformative? That's what we should be talking about. How do we bring transparency and accountability to the next level to make people say, wow, they're taking this power and they're doing something extraordinary to make us believe in government again? If we spend all of our time talking about what the other side is doing wrong, I don't think that works when you're perceived as being in power. And I believe that was a lot that went wrong in 2016. So a big part of what I'm doing is talking about what's next.
You've run for Congress twice and briefly for Allegheny County Executive. What have you learned from these campaigns that you're applying this time around?
Well, I learned a lot about messaging and campaigning in areas that I wasn't familiar with and really reading a room. I also learned a lot about how important what happens at people's kitchen tables is. You know, we get caught up in our bubbles a lot of times, but the important thing is when you're talking to people, talking about how this race affects them. So when I talk about cybersecurity, that's why I like the local aspect of it, because when you hear that information, people look at you and say, wow, that could happen in my school district or my water authority. And it does develop a sense of urgency about how important this office is in a way that I don't think we've really seen before.
What distinguishes you from your opponent?
Well, I would say that there's a number of stances I've taken. For instance, I'm the only person in this race on either side of the aisle who has spoken out basically against the investment in Israeli bonds. I've spoken out. I'm the only one against the Keystone Saves program. I'm the only one that is coming out saying this is a mistake I made and this is how we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again, and we're going to make sure that the taxpayers and the voters get all the information that there is. Both of my opponents on both sides, I think, have made some significant mistakes, and they refuse to own them or take accountability. And I think that's the biggest thing that differentiates me. If the people want somebody who plays talking points and covers it up and really digs their heels in when an error is made, I think that's what we're combating as Democrats against Donald Trump. But it is important to show that nobody is above the law. And when you attack your opponent for doing something that you did, what you're saying is, I'm above the law, but she isn't. I am the only one saying none of us are above the law, including me.
Erin McClelland is a Democratic candidate seeking the nomination for state treasurer. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.